Hello there. Today is actually Creator Mass Day. Yesterday was Creator Mass Eve. So this is actually a bonus day for the 12 days of Creator Mass. And I thought that we could probably go over, continue on with what we were doing yesterday, which is making that Saucy gift wrap, ribbon gift wrap. So where did we get to? Number 5, I think. So as mentioned yesterday, did some work on this offline, not this version, but did some work on this offline because we looked at 2 different ways of creating a gift wrap type clothing item. So what we were looking at was essentially, there it is. What we were essentially looking at is just finding a quick way or a cheap way of hiding where a ribbon would actually have to wrap around on itself. So the first approach is just to do a band that wraps around the mesh and have it cross over in front of the avatar or behind something that can be used as an object to obscure where a join or crossover or something would be placed. So this is how you can use objects to hide things without necessarily going through all the detailing that would be necessary in order to do it properly, essentially. But this is also a quick way or a cheaper way of making something like this, where you create a single loop that just wraps around, that can be duplicated and used wherever it needs to be used. So we've got the same mesh down at the bottom. We didn't shape this, but same mesh down at the bottom where we're reshaping this. It's the same loop, but we can shape this to fit the avatar. And do a similar thing. Oh, we can get rid of these now because these are to accommodate the boobs. So we can collapse those. So that's double tap, select them, double tap the G key and let it edge slide, or use the edge slide tool, which is this one. Then we need to get rid of them. So that is select all and then clean up, merge by distance. That just removes those. So we're using the same mesh but just in different areas or places. So we change the context but not the actual mesh structure. And we can probably get rid of some of these as well. So we can either double tap, or another way to get rid of mesh unwanted structure. So we can select the element that we want to get rid of. We want to get rid of some of these edges. And we should have mesh, delete, and we want dissolve edges. And what this does, it will remove the edge but keep the structure. Otherwise, if we delete it, we create a gap and it doesn't actually get rid of everything that we need to get rid of, because what it does is it leaves the vertexes that are associated with the edge that we just removed. So what we have to do is dissolve, undo, mesh, delete, dissolve edges, and that'll dissolve it and remove the vertexes. Resolve edges. So this would be a quick way of using the same mesh but changing the context. Oh, we could add the edge back in there just to balance that out. But this approach isn't necessarily realistic, so to speak, but it is easier to do. Because the more complicated version, which is what we went for, let's exit edit mode, save that. Save as 5B. Because the approach we actually went for, did we actually do a copy in here? Yes, so what we started doing was creating an actual ribbon that wraps around the avatar, and this was just a plain add mesh plane, whoops, which is all the way over there, make that larger. So all we did was just place the plane, position it roughly where it needs to be, and then in edit mode we just started to extrude edges, and we were following a basic pattern around the avatar, just blocking out the shape. Don't have to worry about it being precise. So I'm just tracing around the mesh that we created yesterday. Because what we then do is go back over the mesh and create the detail that we want to actually add. So, whoops. The extrude tool is a little tricky to work with. If you click the little plus symbol, it'll extrude along this indicator, so it'll basically extrude that way. But if you click the actual I guess that's the neck, I don't know what you would call that. If you actually click on the neck of the extrude tool, if you click right on it, you can extrude along a particular direction. So that's what we did yesterday. We started that from a plane, just extruded it around. But it was going to take quite a while to do, so did this offline and finish this up offline. So number 8. So that's what we ended up with, and this was done using the technique that we just looked at, extruding and wrapping it around. Did I do another one? I'm sure I did another one. Open. Don't save. No, that's the last one. Right, so that's all we did, was just extruded it. But whilst the advantage of this is that it follows the avatar more precisely and it wraps around, the downside is it creates a colossal a colossally long, whoops, wrong one, colossally long UV map. So that is our texture, and the actual UV map for this, let me just select all. So when you do something like this, the disadvantage of doing this is that, let's make sure that deselect, select. The original UV for this looks like that. Or it can be even more severe and look like a C shape. So what you then have to do is spend your time straightening that out. And the only way to do that is by manually selecting each of the vertexes and just positioning them. So the way that this was done was to rotate the UV first so that we're in a general alignment with the texture. So that's what we start with. Oh, we've got, let's just disable that for now. And then what you have to do, select individual vertexes and just line one bottom edge. Don't worry too much about the spacing between them. Just get them all roughly aligned. Just one set. So this bottom edge, what you're doing is just lining that bottom edge. And what this then does is it forces the rest of the map, when you rejig the map, it forces the rest of it to follow the vertexes. Whoops. And we can ensure that by selecting the vertexes that we've just laid out. From the UV menu, we select Pin. Shortcut key for that is P. And what that does is it fixes the position of the UVs. So Pin, and they get a little red marker appearing. And what that'll do is that when you redo the map, or when you rebuild it, there it is, unwrap. That should be at the top of the list, but there we go. That's Blender for you. It forces the map to use those points as a reference, and then if you do that for the whole you're just doing it on one edge. Oops. Same again, pin those. And then we can redo the map. Press the U key. And we've now got the map more or less starting to line up. So what you then do is obviously do the rest of them. So pin all the bottom edge so that they're all approximately on the same level. And that'll reorganize the UV map. And then using the widest section, which is probably going to be the width of the actual UV map itself. That's how wide it should be at its widest point. So if we look at this, so it's quite narrow here, but it's quite wide here. So that will be your reference point. So align the bottom edge, redo the map, and then align the top edge so that that's all straight and the same distance between the top and the bottom. Pin those and then rebuild the UV map, and it'll straighten everything out, so you'll end up with this is the materials, select, you'll end up with something like that. And it doesn't matter what the middle row's doing, because that will align itself relative to the pinned vertices. So once we've got the UV map sorted out, we can then assign our materials to it, and we've got 2 in this instance, because what we've done again is we've used the technique that we had that we introduced on one of the earlier episodes, where we've made the ribbon double-sided by duplicating the mesh and inverting it. So deselect everything. So we want to select just the yellow, and there we've got, that's a duplicate that's inverted so that it faces inwards instead of facing outwards like the red. And we do that, mesh, normals, and then flip. So if you watch what happens to the yellow or the gold, mesh, normals, flip, they invert. So they are now facing the same way as the red. And that's all we did. And then it's just a question of tweaking the vertexes, getting the shape that you want, and then the next bit, which is what we'll do now, is weight painting this to the avatar or to the skeleton. And this, for clothing, is probably the hardest part, because, and you won't find this mentioned in any tutorials anywhere, when you're making clothing, what you have to do is you're not especially making a shirt or a top or any particular type of product. What you're actually doing is structuring your mesh, so it may be a shirt or a jumper. What you should be doing is structuring your mesh so that, as we can see from the, let's hide that. Let's hide that. So we've got the wireframe for the avatar enabled so that we can see it. And we can see that the avatar has this structure. And we've got these ones that go around. There's this one that goes all down the arm. What we have to do when we make our items is that we don't necessarily have to replicate this, but we have to get our meshes as close to this structure as possible. Because when the avatar twists and moves, that structure determines how the avatar mesh, not the skeleton, how the avatar mesh itself distorts and deforms. So if your product, your mesh, doesn't match that, we haven't got this weight painted yet, so it won't do it. What will start to happen is we'll start to see the avatar clipping through. So you'll be able to see the avatar mesh poking through bits of your product. So although we can make things at a relatively low polygon count, so they're quite low density meshes, once you start weight painting your mesh to the avatar and you start deforming or checking the deformation of the character and your product in relation to it, you may find that you actually have to start adding more structure to the mesh that at minimum should replicate this structure of the avatar in order for your mesh to deform properly. So that's it. It's important from the point of view of ensuring that your products work properly in IMVU, or they deform as they should do in IMVU, but it's not so critical that you need to exactly replicate this structure. So if you can get away with fewer, so for example, if we, as we are looking at the back, so we've got this diamond section in the center here. Your product may not necessarily need this stuff in the middle, but it may need the larger structures that are on the outside. So you have to make an assessment, and it's the same all the way down the back actually, because there's an edge that goes down the back there. So the bigger structure is this stuff that's on the outside of this section. So this describes a larger structure, but inside that we've got all of this. And we don't necessarily need any of the stuff that's in the middle, but it's dependent on your product. So you could have your mesh structured so that it's like that without all this stuff in the middle, and you would still get a decent deformation of the mesh. Actually, you might need some of these that go across, but you won't necessarily need this one down the center or this. So that's something to just keep an eye out for when you are making your clothing products, or products that will be using the clothing derivable, I guess. Yes, clothing derivable. You see, so there's an edge down the center there. You may not necessarily need that. So let's get to weight painting and see how our ribbon deforms. So for that, select the armature and the product, and then switch to weight painting. So we should, oh, it's doing the same thing again. Have we weight, no we haven't. So what we need to do, select the mesh, modifiers, add modifier, armature, and we can click in the input field, and it's always going to be female 03 master root, and that's even for the male avatar as well. So select that. That is now associated with our mesh, so that's the armature that we're going to be using. It's now associated with our mesh, so we should now be able to weight paint. So select the armature, mesh, weight paint, and now we can select our bones. So let's weight paint. And this could be tricky because we do have an inside and outside of the mesh. Let's switch to shaded view. It's a bit easier to see. Hide the naked top, naked bottom. Yeah, so because we've got both an inside and outside mesh that are separate, they're joined together at the moment for the purposes of doing weight painting. You have to make sure that you paint both on the inside and the outside of the mesh to ensure the values are painted across properly. So this could be a little tricky depending on your product. And because we can't paint through things, often have to get into these very weird orientations of the scene in order to paint something. And obviously watch out if you are photosensitive for the flickering that occurs. Get up inside there. Hi Zen, it is 2.8. What version is this? Yeah, it's 2.81. Two 2.80 would work just as well though. Window? What window? Oh, yes, it's a folder. Yeah, it's a folder. Whoops, we've painted the wrong bone to that. So that bone now controls all of those, which it shouldn't do. So we have to delete that group because we don't want that bone to control any of that. So the way to do that is you can either paint over it or just delete the group in vertex groups. Click the minus button and it'll just delete the group. Oh, I've been Blender. That's a good question. Probably, I don't recall off the top of my head, but 1 point. Well, before 1.3, so maybe 1.28, 1.26, 24, 22. I think the earliest was 1.20. So I've been using Blender since when it was part of Not a Number, which is about, well, it's a couple of decades ago now, I guess. So a long time. Right, so we've got the right bone selected. Now we should have to do that again. It's created our appropriate vertex group. I wonder if, can we do X-ray with this? No, we can't. Why can't we do X-ray? That's a shame. Because that would help speed things up a lot. So we're just weighting the section at the top of the mesh. It's going to be controlled by spine 04. So we're looking at the mesh front on. We're going to be looking at essentially weighting anything that's in this area, and then for the next bone down we'll probably weight this section. So we're breaking the skeleton down into sections or areas, and then weighting the parts of the mesh that roughly fall within the realms of those bones, or the bones that are. But it's not, with a shape like this, it's not always going to be clean cut, so we'll probably see this shortly when we weight some of the other bones. There we go. You have to make sure, this is the downside of using a double-sided mesh. We could separate the two of them, but then we've got the hassle of making sure that we are duplicating the weight values across both meshes, and that can be kind of tricky. So let's do that one for that bone. Get in there. Right, select the next bone down. Create a new group for that. That includes some of the sections that we've just been painting. And we just want to have the brush influence set to 1, which is basically 100% influence. So we can already do a quick test with this. So we've got two bones more or less set up. So we can select the orange tinted bones are our control bones. They're called inverse kinematics. That allows us to control a chain of bones, so they'll all twist and manipulate the mesh based on what the top bone does. So press the G key and that'll just deform the mesh, and we can see that we've got a few vertices that are missing from the two bones that we've been looking at now. Do that again. So with an object like this is actually quite tricky because we're not really following a formal structure like we might do with a shirt or some other top. So what we've got to do is essentially just go over the mesh, manipulate the bones and see what moves and what doesn't move. So check the top one. So there is something there that we've missed. So this is where you're going to have to be quite dexterous with your scene manipulation and being able to get down into, there we go, in order to get right up to the vertex that needs to be painted, because the values, as we can see here, the values don't always apply as they should. So manipulate that bone, there we go, so that's a bit better. We can include those two. Which means we now have to get down onto the inside. Yeah, so watch out for, if you have photosensitivity, which basically means that you're going to be triggered, to use the word, by the flashing. You're going to have to watch out for that whilst you're doing this, particularly if you have a double-sided mesh. And as far as I'm aware, there isn't a way of avoiding that. So that's that. Let's try the next one down. I wonder if, let me try something. Object. Edit mode. So if you're in solid mode, you can backface cull, which means remove the side, the back face, the flip side of a face from the viewport shading properties. But if you're in shading mode, you can't do that. You have to do that from the material properties, and that's down here, backface culling. So because of the change in the render engine to the IMVU, the Blender uses, the different ways that faces can be backface culled or removed from rendering differs depending on what mode you're in. Got an article on that somewhere. Drop that in chat. Backface culling. There we go. And if you're doing it by... oh no, that's included. And it differs if you are using Eevee versus cycles. So there's all that to contend with. So let's see if we can continue. No, it doesn't do it. That's a shame, because I wonder if we can do it in wireframe. Nope, because we can't see anything. So there's got to be a better way. Because this is one of the challenges. Because with this being double-sided, what we could do so make sure we're just selecting that. Faces, select. Separate selection. And what that's done, whoops, if I can select it, is it separated the two meshes out. Need to change the not clip start. Where's the no, it's not in there anymore, is it? There we go, scale. Come on. So if this was just single-sided, this would be a doddle. See how quick that is? But the problem with single-sided mesh is that we have to make sure that we duplicate the weight paint values that we assigned to the single side of the mesh to both sides of the mesh, to both inside and outside. So we have to weight paint two meshes. Whoops. So we then also have to replicate the colours that we've got on this. But it's so much quicker. Just single-sided meshes are so much quicker to weight paint than double-sided meshes. But you run the risk of getting your weight paint values all messed up. So choose your battles, I guess. Want to make sure all of that is red. And then of course you have to remember which bone you were using. Toggle. So that's that bone. Print all of those values at the top. So double check. Come on, Blender, wake up. There we go. Karuna Chaos. You can, theoretically, but you would only be doing it for your own purposes, of course. Bringing the IMVU avatar into another chat service. Because obviously you'd be subject to copyright and what have you. Gift Wars. Exion. Yes, it still goes on. Gift Wars. Oh, welcome to the stream, by the way. So yes, we're just going through the process of, come on Blender, wake up. It doesn't like quick transitions from one object selection to another. Doesn't like it at all. Right, so we need to wipe the colours associated with those bones, that bone. You've never seen IMVU design? You mean you've never seen anyone making any IMVU products before? So we switch the weight value to 0, and that nulls all the influence that that group had on these vertexes that we're painting out. Yeah, there's still quite an active creator community, because there isn't really any sort of viable alternatives to what IMVU has to offer. The Second Life, which people go to, but the investment level that's required to get into that is greater than it is for IMVU, so people tend to stick with IMVU. IMVU VR has been discussed, but it's never come to anything. But it's not as though IMVU themselves are not aware of a VR aspect of IMVU, but that would be very interesting indeed. Right, so we've nulled out all of those, because what we want to do now is replicate it doesn't like the switch. We've got to replicate that assignment. Whoops, got to change that back to 1 on the other half of the inside of the mesh. Yes, a lot of people still spend quite a bit of cash, real cash, in IMVU. So IMVU, I guess you could call, is you could say is what's the word? Microtransactions. Loot boxes before loot boxes became a thing, basically. You know you can cash those in now, right, Kronos? Oh, I don't know how you pronounce that name. Kuronkos? Yeah, depending on how many you've got, you can cash them in. That's the whole point of the creator program. But you have to do that through IMVU now, not the resellers. They got rid of those a long time ago. And some would argue that that was the single-handed move that lost a lot of creators. So do we have to go around the back there? But this is the problem with double-sided meshes. It's either way, it's going to be time-consuming to do your weight paints. So if you have the two meshes in situ, and you're trying to paint both of them in situ as a single unified mesh, you're going to be spending more time flipping around the model inside and out so that you can paint both the inside and outside faces. But if they are separated, you're still going to spend more time transferring or making sure that you've replicated the color values for your weight painting. to both meshes. So either way, this is time consuming. There isn't a quick way to do this. I wonder though, can you select, select, select? I don't know if you can do multiple meshes. No, you can't. That would be handy as well. Oh, taxes, yeah. Yes, you have to submit your WD or whatever it is. But you know, if you're earning quite a bit, it's worth doing, because there are some creators still earning quite substantial amounts of money. And as the saying goes, every penny counts. Kuro Neko Senpai. Oh, right. Yeah, well, you know, horses for courses, so to speak. It can be, depending on your occupation, what you do work-wise. If you have a job, it can make your taxes much more complicated to be having income on the side, because IMVU declares all their earnings and royalty payments to the IRS. So the IRS would have a record of you being in receipt of some money, and they would want their 12 pieces of silver, or 7 bits of 8. Well, that's pretty good going. So I think what we'll do with this is just we'll concentrate on just doing the outside of this, and then so that we may be able to get something inside IMVU in the time frame that we've got. So I'll come back I'll do it offline. I'll continue on with painting up the inside of the mesh, and then I'll upload those files for anyone that's interested to play around with. Oh yeah, well, as Forrest Gump would say, and that's all I have to say about that. But he would say it in his Texas drawl. So again, we're creating a group that is roughly within this zone. but because of the shape of the mesh, we are likely going to need to play around with the weight values to get something that deforms comfortably without going all over the place. Because that's the other thing about what is essentially a layered clothing item, or a layered item generally, is that not only do you have to consider making sure that you don't intersect the avatar, so you're following the structure as we were discussing earlier, you've also got to make sure that you're not intersecting your mesh. So if it wraps around on itself, we've got to weight paint this and test this out so that when this section deforms, it's not going to intersect this section that's under here. So there's a lot to think about with your weight painting. So what got you to stop using IMVU? That goes to both of you, by the way. Did you just get bored of it? Oh, VR chat, yes. Yes, that's becoming the new hot thing at the moment. Based on, that's the one that's based on Unity. Right, so let's just do a quick test of this. That works. That works. So what we also want to do is include this bit in there. So when that moves, it moves the ribbon, or the tail end of the ribbon. Probably want that one as well. Yeah, Unity and Blender, right. That's VR chat. Yes, I mean, as far as I'm aware, IMVU, because they did have a Unity project, but it never got anywhere. Right, so let's go down the avatar skeleton. So we've got the top bone, and check what that moves. Check what that moves. Right, so now we're getting down into the hips. So this is technically starting to be, let's get rid of that one. So now we have to start considering, oh, don't you dare crash. So speaking of which, better save the file. Save as. Yes, IMVU did have a Unity project, but they didn't seem to have much interest in it. So for the hips, the zone that we want to create now is likely going to include all of that, even though we have the the thigh bone, which will also include quite a substantial area of the mesh. But whether the thing actually has that as the final, whether the grouping is like that finally at the end of all of this will depend on how the mesh deforms with the avatar, with the skeleton. Because although we can roughly break, so although we can paint these zones, so this section, everything in here is associated with the hip bone, we could do that, but when the hip bone manipulates, it'll be quite hard, or quite an abrupt manipulation. So when the thigh bone manipulates, it won't deform quite as much as we're expecting it to. So, whoops. So we've got to get the balance right. So I'll just do this quickly. See what I mean. Because what we're doing is sharing the influence of these points on the mesh between several bones. And depending on the value of that influence. Right, so if we grab that, that works quite well. But if you use the individual bones, so if we're using the IK, the inverse kinematic, and we're modifying a bone chain, so that includes those two bones, because the movement is shared across those two bones, we're going to get a slightly different flavor of mesh deformation than if we just rotate an individual bone. So we have to watch out for the weight paint values that we assign to. So for example, with the hip bone, that moves quite well, but with the thigh bone we get this poke out. It starts to poke out of the mesh here because we haven't got a 100% value on some of these vertex points. So what you'll end up doing is putting your posing your mesh, posing the avatar in all sorts of awkward positions to try and determine how the weight values are assigned to the mesh and how each, oh crikey, that's buried right inside there, and how each is influencing the mesh to either aid or, there we go, crikey, you've got to really work your way around that, to influence the mesh. And there's one there as well that's not quite red. Because although this avatar is set up so that it has an IK, so I can press the G key and it'll move several bones at once. in order to get this mesh to work correctly, there is an assumption that the avatar skeleton that's used in 3D Studio Max or whatever it is to create a pose works in the same way. So if you manipulate a chain of bones, you're going to get a different response from the mesh than if you manipulated individual bones. So there's all these little considerations that have to be kept in mind when you are weight painting to make sure that your mesh deforms properly. So we can see with this bone twisted out, let me just undo that. So with, don't you crash on me. So if you paint a, there's a vertex just here. So if we paint a value of 100% to that, the vertex changes position because it's now adjusting itself or readjusting itself to where it would be in relation to the bone being deformed the way that it is. Where's that vertex gone? Oh, there it is. And it's the same for thigh bone. So that should be okay for those. Maybe that one and that one. So reset those. That's Alt R. It just resets them. Let's hide that inside mesh. So other side, same thing again. And we also want to be careful as to whether, so at the moment, this tail is associated with this bone. So we have to decide, so when the spine moves, that tail moves. But it's within a control zone that's controlled by the hip and the thigh bone. So we have to decide whether we want this section of the mesh. So I guess it would be this bit, whether that's associated with that and whether the rest of this is going to be associated with the hip bone. Because it changes the behavior of the mesh. So let's just, whilst we've got the thigh bone selected, so if we move that, it now moves the ribbon. And the hip bone will move it as well now, because the thigh bone is part of that bone chain that it's controlling. So whenever the thigh bone moves, this section of the mesh will move, irrespective as to whether there's anything associated with the hip bone, which ordinarily might be this section at the top. And we obviously only want to do one side of the mesh, left or right, depending on the bone that's selected. to the midpoint. So that should now mean all of that moves. So we've now got that issue that we were talking about earlier, where we've got the mesh clipping inside itself. So we would have to include all of this in the hip bone in order for this entire section, all of that needs to move with the hip bone, otherwise it's just going to clip. Inside the mesh, where is it? There it is. It's a shame that you can't weight paint from the opposite side. I'm sure there's probably a setting somewhere that allows it. So we've still got a little bit of clipping there. And in areas where there isn't necessarily a center line. So for the right and left thigh, there isn't a center line dividing the two of them. So it's okay to cross over onto the other side and paint a value, because that'll share that value or distribute that value across there. Same for the thigh bones. Don't want to go too far though. So I don't know if we're going to get this done, because as you can see, it's quite time consuming to get all of the weight painting done. Where's the torso? There it is. But what we can do is, and this is why we have the clothing file, clothing avatar file. if your mesh matches the movement of the avatar mesh, it should be more than likely safe in IMVU. So we're kind of getting there. Whoops. But we can see how incredibly time consuming it is to get all of this stuff sorted out. But this is what you'll be doing with a clothing file, is checking how well the mesh deforms. And in some instances it's going to be unavoidable where we've got these bits clipping the way that they are now. So that could be something to do with just relieving the stress or the influence of certain vertexes depending on what bone. So as we can see here, we're relieving the stress on that section of the mesh by just completely wiping out the influence that the hip bone had on these vertexes. But we still do need it to deform to a certain degree. So rather than 0, it might be, let's do 0.25. Paint that onto those, and that works. So we've still got some influence by the hip bone on this section of the mesh. So that it deforms properly. So 0.5. Let's try 0.5 on these. That's too much. 0.25. But this is where we have to start considering whether we add more structure to the mesh, because what we could do to relieve the stress or the stretch that's being caused by this section because of the orientation of the thigh bone, what we could do is add another loop cut down the center there, and that would give more structure to share the influence of these two bones across. So there's all sorts of things that you can do to relieve the stress. 0.1. So not everything is going to be full influence, i.e. red. Some of it will be half influence, which is green, and then we've got quarter influence, so that's full, 100%. That's 50. That's 25. And that's going to be about 10% or maybe 5. So the colours are red, green, and then they fade out to dark blue, which is 0. So yes, I think we'll call it quits there. I'll finish this off offline, and then make the files available. I might do another stream on this because the weight painting stuff, all of this is quite important, and it's stuff that isn't covered in any particular detail in any of the tutorials, because of course IMVU themselves use 3D Studio Max. So I think that's what we'll do. I'll finish this off offline and then maybe do another stream in the next couple of days, another bonus Creator Mass stream. So yeah, let me save that. Save as 10. So yeah, thanks for sticking around, everyone, and thanks to lurkers and the chatters alike. And Merry Creator Mass. I hope you have a good day today, and we shall see you on the next stream, where hopefully we can get somewhere with this weight painting. But as you can see, it's very time consuming and fiddly and time consuming. Right, on that note then, we shall call it quits, and adieu, as they say in somewhere or other where they say that. Anyway, speak to you soon.